I think we're good to start. It's now 5 minutes past 3 at Pia time. Talo Falava, hello Olgeta, and Bola. My name is Wami Valentine, the Communications Manager with the PACER Plus Implementation Unit. I'm very pleased and grateful that you're able to join us this afternoon. On behalf of the team, on behalf of my colleague, Dr. Alisi, and the head of the unit, Mr. Roy Langolango, we're very grateful that you're here today. And we hope that you'll find this webinar this time most beneficial. Just very briefly on the program of this afternoon's webinar, presentation will be done by Dr. Alisi Holanis, who's currently joining us from Nuku'alofa in Tonga. Towards the end of her presentation, we'll go for a short break, and then we'll come back and we'll open up the floor for some questions. I note that I've got some questions here that's been sent in by many of you through the registration form, and we'll put that across to Dr. Alisi. However, if at any time during the presentation you wish to ask a question, we invite you to do so. You'll note at the bottom of your screen there is a Q&A feature. If you click on that and type in your question, we'll get to that at the end of the presentation once the floor is open for Q&As. Due to the time that we have, I think we scheduled for about 45 minutes to an hour. We'll do our best to get through all the questions that we have. However, if we're not able to get to all the questions, please note that we will address them individually or personally via email. That simply is what we could do. If you've got any questions for the arrangement of labor mobility or any of the topics that's been discussed in the presentation this afternoon, please feel free to use the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. I also want to quickly make mention before I introduce the speaker. I want to make mention of the fact that we will also be conducting other webinars on different components of the PACER Plus agreement. To that end, I invite you to log on to our website, which is pacerplus.org, pacerplus.org, and we will be updating the website as and when the webinars are available, so that you could add them onto your calendars. And you could join us also, probably virtually or even face-to-face, if that happens. Very quickly as well, I just want to mention that there's also an email address, enquiries@pacerplus.org, and we'll be sharing this information throughout the presentation this afternoon. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Alisi Holani, our labor mobility specialist, joining us from Tonga. Pinaka, Dr. Alisi.
Malo lele, and welcome to our webinar this afternoon on the PACER Plus arrangement on labor mobility, which I will tend to refer to as the arrangement in this presentation. Today is really just an introduction to the arrangement, and the aim is to increase awareness on what this arrangement is, why it's important for the Pacific, and how it can benefit the region. And when we're talking about labor mobility in this webinar, we are referring to circular labor mobility, where Pacific workers temporarily enter receiving countries for employment, then return to their countries of origin at the end of their employment terms. They can re-engage again if they wish, hence establishing the circularity of labor mobility. As Wame mentioned, we will not be covering any other chapters of the PACER Plus agreement today, and would encourage you to check out our website for more information. Also, we will not be going into the details of existing labor mobility schemes, but hope to run other webinars on that topic in the near future. So please watch this space. To understand the importance of the PACER Plus arrangement on labor mobility, it's critical to first establish the significance of labor mobility to sustainable development in the region. So I'd like to start our discussion today by looking at some of the key reasons why labor mobility is considered to be an important development strategy for Pacific Island countries. Now, the significance of labor mobility stems from the unique development challenges that our region faces. So it's important to first look at the Pacific development dilemma to provide some context. Apart from PNG, our region is comprised of some of the smallest island countries in the world. Although some have extensive exclusive economic zones, the disadvantages of smallness, particularly our small market sizes, are persistent. The implications of smallness include limited opportunities for economies of scale, restricted opportunities for diversification, and very high input costs, which reduces the competitiveness of our exports in the global market. And given that these small countries are price takers in the world economy, capital investments could yield negative returns, and high production costs may even render some countries' comparative advantages unfeasible. Our isolation. As we are ocean-bound and dispersed over the largest ocean in the world, far from key world markets, we face higher transportation costs. Transportation options are restricted to air and sea, and per unit transportation costs are relatively higher. And so, consequently, many Pacific Island countries face high cost restrictions to developing competitive industries and exports. Talking about our environmental vulnerability, the World Risk Index ranks many Pacific countries as amongst those facing the highest risk of experiencing a natural disaster. The onset of climate change has not only increased the intensity and frequency of natural disasters, but threatens the very existence of many small island states in our region. The economic cost of this is very high. The cost of damages and losses has set back GDP growth in many countries and have had adverse effects on the rural sector as well as on food security. So it is in this context that Pacific Island governments strain to determine viable development strategies that are built on their strengths, yet able to overcome their geographic disadvantages. For these small economies, there is wide consensus that trade integration is fundamental for sustainable development. And when we're considering the gains from international trade, we need to understand that the gains from trade lie in the exploitation of differences in factor endowment ratio and preferences. For most Pacific Island countries, the largest difference they can exploit is in labor mobility, particularly of low-skilled workers. This is the factor endowment that we have in relative abundance, and the endowment that developed countries like Australia and New Zealand are increasingly lacking, due mostly to their aging demographics. Exploiting these differences could potentially generate the largest returns for Pacific Island countries. And so from this perspective, labor mobility can be considered as one of the few export opportunities that can overcome the region's geographic development constraints, and therefore a viable development approach for Pacific Island countries. The Pacific is also increasingly facing the challenge of identifying an employment creation strategy for its rapidly growing population. The total population of Pacific Island countries is growing faster than the world average of 1.1%, particularly in Melanesia, where countries like Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and PNG are growing at more than double the world average. Many would consider the region's sizable youth population, or what we call the youth bulge, as a potential dividend for growth. But Pacific Island countries have not been able to generate this dividend due to the inability of their formal economies to absorb the substantial numbers of school leavers each year. In fact, the projected rapid growth of working-age Pacific populations over the next 40 years is expected to create new development problems. The private sector in most Pacific Island countries are small and nascent and would not have the capacity to absorb its growing working-age population. As such, unemployment and underemployment are expected to be ongoing development challenges, particularly in the region. And as you can see in the graph provided here, it is already a challenge for many countries. Looking at Nauru with an unemployment rate of 22.9%, followed by Samoa at 14.47%. A viable alternative solution is for the Pacific labor to access the labor markets of developed countries. From this perspective, labor mobility presents an employment strategy that is not restricted by our region's geographic development challenges, but enables workers to access temporary employment overseas and return to support local development in their respective countries. Now, the development gains for sending countries from labor mobility is transmitted through the remittances that workers transfer to their households and communities, and the skills that they acquire during the course of their employment overseas. Remittances primarily exist as an important capital flow because of its large volume. In fact, remittance flows can be larger than other capital flows. In Tonga's case, for example, remittances in 2020 accounted for 39% of its GDP, while export receipts accounted for only 19% and foreign direct investment only 9%. Remittances have also been found to be higher than overseas development assistance. And again, in the case of Tonga in 2021, remittances reached 490 million pa'anga, while ODA was less than half of that. Since we are net importing countries, remittances provide critical foreign exchange earnings necessary to offset our relatively large balance of payment deficits. The development importance of remittances is also due to its stability and counter-cyclical nature. Remittances have been found to show strong resilience in times of economic downturn. And as you can see in Tonga, for example, as shown in this graph, remittances continue to increase steadily after the onset of COVID-19 at the end of 2019, reaching 490 million pa'anga in 2021. In contrast, foreign direct investment and export receipts declined, thus highlighting the resilience of remittances. As remittances are private transfers, their resilience has provided an important safety valve to cushion the impact of economic downturns on household incomes, and therefore having a direct impact on poverty alleviation. In addition to remittances, labor mobility can also be a process of human capital formation. Studies have shown that the most effective approach would be for sending and receiving countries to collaborate in the development of targeted skills development programs, beginning at the pre-departure stage and continuing during their employment overseas. This would enable workers to return with skills that they can transfer for local development in their respective countries. Remittances and skills from labor mobility can further contribute to local development in sending countries through investment in productive activities. And for this reason, support for effective economic reintegration is an important part of circular labor mobility. These benefits of labor mobility substantiate the consideration that labor mobility is an important development approach because it can deliver triple wins for workers, their countries of origin, and the countries that receive them. However, I'd like to stress that it is important for countries to understand that these positive development impacts are not always automatic. And in fact, they may remain elusive unless conducive conditions and policies are present in both sending and receiving countries. The reality is that there are adverse effects of labor mobility that can compromise the potential positive development impact on Pacific sending countries. These can include skill strain, as employed skilled workers leave their jobs to participate in labor mobility. It can include the disincentive effect of remittances, where increased dependence on remittances can result in reduced household labor participation, and not to mention the negative social impacts on families and communities left behind. Mitigating these risks and enhancing the potential development gains from labor mobility requires effective cooperation between Pacific sending countries and receiving countries. It is for this reason that the PACER Plus arrangement on labor mobility is so important. The arrangement on labor mobility exists as a side arrangement to the PACER Plus agreement. It was signed alongside the agreement in July 2017 in Tonga, and the picture here is from after the signing ceremony. Since July 2017, 11 countries have signed the arrangement. These are Australia, the Cook Islands, Kiribati, Nauru, New Zealand, Niue, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. Representatives from these participant countries sit in the Labor Mobility Working Group, which is the body responsible for administering the implementation of the arrangement on labor mobility. The group tends to meet twice a year and intersessionally when required. It's important to clarify that only countries who have signed the arrangement are eligible for support under the arrangement. The only exception to this is the Pacific Labor Mobility Annual Meeting, otherwise known as the PLAM, where non-participant countries are also invited to attend. So I'd like to now take you through the content of the arrangement so you can have a better idea of what it is and its potential benefits for countries. The arrangement on labor mobility is effectively a regional framework for labor mobility cooperation with the purpose of strengthening labor mobility cooperation between the participant countries. Labor mobility in the arrangement is defined as the temporary movement of workers of one participant country to another for the purpose of temporary employment. This definition establishes a broad scope covering low-skilled, semi-skilled, as well as potentially skilled labor mobility. It is not restricted to existing labor mobility schemes and provides for potential expansion to new labor mobility pathways within and outside of existing schemes, including for intra-Pacific labor mobility to Pacific receiving countries, such as the Cook Islands and Niue. The priorities of the arrangement are further enshrined in its 8 objectives. These key priorities include promoting regional cooperation, including through the plan, enhancing labor mobility schemes, increasing positive development impacts, exploration and utilization of new labor mobility opportunities, including to Australia and New Zealand, strengthening institutional frameworks and governance of labor mobility, building labor supply capacity of Pacific sending countries, including through TVET pathways, and support for recognition of qualifications. In terms of the key provisions of the arrangement, paragraph 4 provides for the plan, and this is one of the key provisions of the arrangement. The plan is expected to be a mechanism to advance labor mobility cooperation and facilitate the review of progress against the key objectives of the arrangement. The plan seeks to be as inclusive as possible. And as mentioned before, non-participant countries as well as other key stakeholders are invited to attend. Paragraph 5 provides for the enhancement of labor mobility and reinforces the accountabilities provided in the bilateral MOUs and provides the opportunity to enhance existing schemes and expand to new opportunities where there are labor shortages. This provision establishes the opportunity to explore new labor mobility pathways, thereby potentially expanding opportunities for Pacific workers across skill levels, sectors, and even to new Pacific destinations outside of Australia and New Zealand on the condition that there are confirmed labor shortages. Paragraph 6 provides for the support for institutions and recognizes the importance of strong institutions and good governance to enhancing the positive development impacts of labor mobility. It provides for support to build strong institutional frameworks, including through strategic policy development, labor market statistics and information, and effective stakeholder collaborations. Paragraph 7 requires countries to comply with visa and work permit arrangements of other countries. More importantly, it grants the opportunity to explore other visa categories in receiving countries that can facilitate labor mobility. And it also provides for the consideration of requests for simplification of visa procedures. Paragraph 8 recognizes the important role of TVETs to building the labor supply capacity of Pacific sending countries and provides opportunities for the development of TVET pathways for labor mobility. This paragraph also recognizes the importance of labor market information to labor supply management and requires participants to share information on areas of current and projected skill shortages. Paragraph 9 provides for developed country participants to support the development of a framework for qualifications recognition. This would include increasing Pacific countries' capacity to assess qualifications and facilitate the development, accreditation, and registration of qualifications and the recognition of those qualifications. The remaining paragraphs, paragraph 10, 11, and 12, are technical provisions for the setup of contact points, facilitating of technical discussions amongst participants, and conditions for entry into effect, withdrawal, and termination of the arrangement. Essentially, a participant can choose to withdraw from the arrangement by giving written notice to other participants no less than 6 months prior to the date of withdrawal. The arrangement also provides for an independent evaluation of the arrangement within 5 years of its signature. Now, some of you might be wondering why labor mobility was not included as a legally binding chapter of the PACER Plus agreement. Because the PACER Plus is a free trade agreement, it is required to be consistent with the WTO rules. The General Agreement on Trade and Services, otherwise known as the GATS, establishes the movement of natural persons as one of the modes for services trade, otherwise known in trade jargon as Mode 4. However, by definition, it does not cover measures affecting persons seeking access to another member country's employment market. For this reason, it does not cover labor mobility. As per the scope of the GATS, the PACER Plus Movement of Natural Persons chapter is more to facilitate the establishment of a commercial presence by one member country in the territory of another. And so, it's limited to employees of these service firms seeking commercial presence in the territory of another member country and self-employed service suppliers. The extent of Mode 4 liberalization and market access are delineated in parties' schedules of commitments. Australia and New Zealand's movement of natural persons commitments across all sectors are limited to highly skilled intra-corporate transferees, independent executives, business visitors, and contractual service suppliers. So it's clear that the movement of natural persons cannot facilitate labor mobility, especially of low-skilled and semi-skilled Pacific workers seeking temporary employment in other participant countries. Now, because of the limitations of the GATS, most countries have used bilateral labor agreements in the form of MOUs to facilitate and manage labor mobility between two countries. The RSE and the PALM schemes are examples of these bilateral labor agreements. Since these are agreements between two parties, the issue of non-discrimination against a third country does not apply, and parties have the flexibility to establish the scope, access conditions, and labor management measures that best caters to their development interests. When examining the MOU for the PALM and the IAU for the RSE, it is clear that the scope of the bilateral agreements are to facilitate labor mobility for low and semi-skilled workers. And it's mostly limited to the recruitment, mobilization of workers, pastoral care for workers while they are working overseas. And in the case of the PALM, the facilitation of training in Australia to enable workers to undertake the work required of them. We believe that the arrangement on labor mobility complements the bilateral MOUs and can further enhance the development benefits to both sending and receiving countries. Firstly, the fact that the arrangement exists as a side arrangement to the PACER Plus agreement also grants flexibility to members to negotiate and determine measures that can enhance their gains from labor mobility. These deliberations can take place in the plan, side technical discussions, and in the labor mobility working group. In fact, the arrangement does provide for participants to amend the arrangement upon mutual agreement. And secondly, the scope of the arrangement is broader. It covers low-skilled, semi-skilled, and even skilled labor mobility potentially. It is not limited to existing labor mobility schemes, and it covers the full circular labor mobility process, extending beyond recruitment and mobilization to areas such as improved regional cooperation, governance, information sharing, building labor mobility supply, qualifications recognition, and increasing the development impact of labor mobility in both sending and receiving countries. The arrangement also reinforces the importance of bilateral MOUs and the accountabilities provided therein. And most importantly, the arrangement is a regional framework, so it extends beyond 2 countries and therefore has the potential to improve coordination among specific sending countries to further amplify the collective Pacific voice. And since it covers both Australia and New Zealand, the arrangement can also support efforts to harmonize processes and programs in receiving countries. And as mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, the primary purpose of the arrangement is to increase effective regional cooperation, which is the key ingredient for enhancing the positive development impact of labor mobility in both sending and receiving countries. So from this perspective, the prevalence of bilateral MOUs does not render the arrangement on labor mobility as redundant, but rather accentuates the important complementary role of the arrangement. Now, what is the role of the PACER Plus implementation unit? The PACER Plus implementing arrangement provides that once PACER Plus enters into force, an implementation unit will be established to assist the implementation of the agreement. So the PACER Plus implementation unit, otherwise referred to as the IU, is therefore responsible for providing assistance to PACER Plus parties to strengthen their capacity to benefit from regional and international trade and contribute to achieving economic growth and sustainable development. In the case of labor mobility, the IU undertakes the role of Labor Mobility Secretariat and has developed a labor mobility work program to facilitate the implementation of the arrangement by providing assistance to participant countries at the bilateral level or regional level. The work program as provided here is effectively framed by the objectives and provisions of the arrangement on labor mobility and is aimed at progressively improving effective regional labor mobility cooperation. Our 4 main areas of support are 1, regional cooperation, including the plan, efforts to improve regional coordination and collaboration, including with key stakeholders. Our second area of support is in labor mobility governance, where we provide support for the development of national labor mobility policies, legislations, and strategies that will help improve the governance of labor mobility in sending countries. The third area of support is in enhancing labor mobility opportunities. This is where we support the exploration of new pathways to expand labor mobility opportunities for Pacific workers across skill levels and sectors. This includes exploration of opportunities for intra-Pacific labor mobility to countries like I mentioned before, Cook Islands and Niue. And lastly is our program of support to enhance the development impact of labor mobility. Here we provide support for economic reintegration, building labor mobility supply capacities, including through TVET pathways, facilitation of qualifications recognition, and leveraging labor mobility for local private sector development. This program of support also aims at helping countries address potential risks, such as in skills drain and negative social impacts on families and communities in sending countries. It is an ambitious program, but that's mainly because of the broad scope of the arrangement on labor mobility. We recognize that some of these activities are already led by other organizations, and so we seek to not duplicate their work, but to establish effective programs of collaboration that can support participant countries. So in terms of the key organizations that we collaborate with, these organizations at the regional level include the Pacific Labour Facility, the Australian Pacific Labour Facility, the New Zealand Ministry of Business Innovation and Employment, the Pacific Island Forum Secretariat, the World Bank, the ILO, ADB, and IOM. And we anticipate to engage with more stakeholders in specific thematic areas going forward. And this would include NZQA and APTC in the development of labor mobility pathways and qualifications recognition work. With the PPIU labor mobility work program as a guide, our annual plan activities are informed by the plan and consultations with participant countries. So I just want to give you a snapshot of some of the activities we have lined up for 2022-2023. These include the development and review of national labor mobility policies, the development of labor supply management strategy, assessment of potential labor mobility opportunities in the Cook Islands and Niue, development of a reintegration strategy, an entrepreneurship development training module. We're planning on conducting research activities on remittances data collection systems and constraints to workers' access to superannuation funds and potential linkage of these funds to national provident funds in the Pacific. We're also working with the trade and services component on work for qualifications recognition, as well as a stock take of existing business and work visas to Australia and New Zealand. And we are looking forward to the PLAM 2022, which is tentatively scheduled for November in Apia, Samoa. In an effort to improve the effectiveness of the PLAM, we have redesigned the procedures for the PLAM, so this year's meeting will be slightly different. We look forward to receiving many of you there, so please stay tuned for the details, which would be uploaded to our website in due time. With this, I would like to conclude my presentation and hope that you found it useful. Malo apito.
Thank you very much, Alici, for that insightful presentation on the arrangement of labor mobility. I think what we picked from the presentation is that we see that this is really a viable economic solution for the region as far as accessing the labor market in developed countries. But what was key that you pointed out was regional cooperation. I think that's important. I think we'll take maybe take a short break for 2 or 3 minutes, if that's okay, just to allow everyone to grab a cup of water or maybe to stretch for a bit. And then we'll open the floor up to questions. I've got a couple of questions with me that I'll be asking Alici. However, if you have some questions of your own, please feel free to use the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen. Type that in, and we'll put that together. And when we come back, we'll put that across to Alici. Thank you very much. We'll see you in about 2 or 3 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. I hope you've got a nice cuppa next to you, or you've got the chance to take a quick break. We'll proceed now with some questions to Alici. Alici, you there? So,
yes, I'm here, Wame.
Fantastic. In the interim, we encourage you, please utilize the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen if you have any questions for Alici. But I've got a couple here for you, Alici. I'll just ask them through, if that's all right. The first one being, we've got a question sent in. Are there any plans to extend beyond the existing sectors?
So, as mentioned in the presentation, the arrangement provides a broad scope which enables the exploration of new pathways and opportunities to Australia and New Zealand, as well as to other Pacific receiving countries. So there is scope for potential expansions to new sectors, but there are conditions that would have to be considered, including whether there are labor shortages in receiving countries and that there is industry demand for workers from the Pacific in those areas.
Got another question, Alici. Why is labor mobility for the seasonal worker scheme not under trading services for WTO?
I think this is a popular question that many people have asked. But as I mentioned in the presentation, the WTO General Agreement on Trade and Services does not cover measures affecting persons seeking access to another member country's employment market. So essentially, it does not cover labor mobility, particularly for low-skilled and semi-skilled workers. The movement of natural persons is what is covered under the GATS, but is more to facilitate the establishment of commercial presence. And so access is limited to intra-corporate transferees, business visitors, executives, and self-employed service suppliers.
Some confusion on the reference of labor mobility, at least pertaining to PACER Plus. One asked, are we referring to PALMS, SWP, and RSE whenever we refer to labor mobility under PACER Plus? Perhaps you could clarify on that, Alicia?
Yes. The scope of the arrangement is not limited to just the existing schemes. It provides for, like I mentioned before, the exploration and utilization of other visa pathways and new opportunities, including to Pacific receiving countries outside of Australia and New Zealand. So it's not just limited to the existing labor schemes.
Right, we've got a couple more questions coming through.
Sure.
As we wait for them to come through, I just want to quickly mention to the attendees, right after this, we'll be sending out a email, a request for you to fill a very short survey, a post-webinar survey. It'll only take you about 60 seconds, a minute or less. And if we'd appreciate your feedback, following which, if you are interested in obtaining the presentation that Alicia did today, we'll be able to send that through to you. So we'll be sending that shortly at the end of this webinar. One more question here for you, Alicia. Are short-term attachments for semi-skilled fields eligible under labor mobility?
At the moment, I guess the short answer is that it's not covered under existing labor mobility schemes, but it's something that a few Pacific countries have requested us to look into. So in our work program, there is a focus on how we can leverage labor mobility for private sector development, including through the treatment of labor mobility as apprenticeship programs for existing workers and businesses. So we plan to explore this further in the near future.
Almost similar question to that. Do you consider recognizing TVET qualifications from PACER Plus countries in the labor mobility scheme?
I think this was clearly mentioned in the discussion of the provisions in the arrangement. TVET labor mobility pathways and the recognition of qualifications are important priorities in the arrangement on labor mobility. New Zealand, through the NZQA, is currently leading some work on the design of a framework for qualifications recognition, and we are working with them to ensure that it delivers on the objectives of the arrangement.
A question here from labor sending countries here in the Pacific. How can PACER Plus, as a regional body, support a united Pacific approach in dealing with labor mobility issues affecting Pacific Island countries?
This is a good question because MOUs are signed between two countries. And so there can be fragmentation in the Pacific sending countries. So as mentioned in the presentation, since the arrangement is a regional cooperation framework, one of our priorities is to improve coordination amongst Pacific sending countries and so establish a stronger collective Pacific voice. And one of the initiatives that we're looking to support this is the inclusion of a Forum Island Country Caucus in the plan to enable Pacific countries to deliberate on key issues and establish common regional priorities. Other potential initiatives can be roundtables on thematic areas and information sharing amongst Pacific sending countries, but it is a priority under the arrangement.
Yeah, thank you. One on the sort of the welfare of the Pacific workers. A question here: are the employers abroad? Are they complying with the conditions of? Are they complying with the conditions of working conditions reflected in employment contracts? And how could we, as LSU, will be able to quickly resolve these issues? And if there will be any penalties posed to these employers for not complying with these employment contracts?
I know that this is a priority for both Australia and New Zealand. And I know that it is a priority of the Pacific Labour Facility in Australia. And there is a provision under the new PALM MOU addressing this issue. I am certain that this is also a priority for New Zealand. under activities led by their Ministry of Innovation, Business and Employment. So LSUs would be required to work with these organizations to resolve these issues. We can provide, the IU can provide a supporting role in this area if countries deem necessary.
We've got a couple more questions before we wrap up our webinar this afternoon. One question I have here is, what are some of the strategies that PACER Plus agreement have to ensure labor mobility is in compliance with international treaty as well as international conventions?
Good question. As mentioned in the presentation, the arrangement on labor mobility is a side arrangement to the PACER Plus agreement. And so it's not restricted to the rules of the WTO. Participant countries have the flexibility to determine the measures and conditions which best meets their interests. But in terms of other conventions, such as ILO conventions, the ILO takes the lead in this area, and we would work in collaboration with the ILO to provide support with their activities if countries require us to.
We've got one question also from Joe, Talofa Joe. This is in reference to a question I think you addressed earlier on, Alicia, on qualifications. Joe asks, you had mentioned qualification recognition schemes as a pathway for improving labor mobility. Are transnational regional qualifications something that the implementation unit are looking into as well?
The work on the qualifications recognition is still at its very early stage. And so we're looking at regional qualifications recognition. But like I mentioned before, we're still talking to different qualification authorities in countries to better understand what the framework would actually be. But as I mentioned before, this is work that is being led by New Zealand under the NZQA. We can provide more information to you once this work progresses.
Fantastic. I think we've got one more question before we wrap up our session this afternoon. But before we move to the question, just to advise the attendees today that you should receive an email now of the survey, the post-webinar survey. And if you could spare a moment later on this afternoon, later on today, and answer the very brief questions, about 5 in total, we'd appreciate that immensely. We'd also be happy, after you submit your survey, to send you the PowerPoint presentation that Alicia had shared with us today, if you need that. A question from Tuvalu. Will the ALM develop reintegration programs for workers engaging in labor mobility scheme, or just providing support to countries in terms of their reintegration program?
In terms of reintegration strategies, we're really accountable to the countries in what they would require. What we're trying to do now is to look at the regional level and what kind of reintegration framework could work for most countries, but focusing on economic reintegration and how we can leverage labor mobility for entrepreneurship development, MSME investments by workers, their families, and communities. And so we would be looking at the development of key strategies initially, and from there we can look at how we can best support the workers and countries going forward. But the initial priority is the development of a plan, a strategy to help countries promote reintegration.
I think we've got a JEDC related question, perhaps somewhere at the top, if we could scroll to the top. Yes, there we are. Says, thank you, Dr. Lisi, for the informative presentation. Has there been any study or research on gender mainstreaming in the existing labor mobility schemes between the Pacific Islands and Australia and New Zealand?
Thank you for the question. I can only speak to what I know. And as far as I know, there hasn't been any gender research on gender mainstreaming, but this is definitely a top priority for the IU as well as to the receiving countries. I think there is, I have heard that there are plans to look into such research activities, but I am not aware of anything that has been done to date. I could be wrong.
We've got one final question, and I think that would close our webinar this afternoon. And it's a question regarding the relationship between the implementation unit, the Labour Mobility Secretariat, and the PIP's agenda on labour mobility. What's the relationship between those three?
Yes. So the implementation unit, our role is specifically framed, linked to the implementation of the arrangement on labour mobility. We understand that the PIP's agenda on labour mobility might be broader, but we definitely recognize PIPs as an important and critical regional partner in progressing labour mobility in the region. And we're working closely to look at how best we can collaborate to support countries and the region in labour mobility.
I think we could close our webinar with that question and that brilliant answer, because that's the final question we have for this afternoon. And with that, we'd like to thank all of you, the attendees, and indeed you as well, Alicia, for joining us from the Kingdom of Tonga. Thankfully, we had great internet connection today, so that's brilliant. And I'd like to encourage the attendees again today, if you would jump onto our website, pacerplus.org. There's also the email that I sent a few moments ago on the post-webinar survey, also has a link to our monthly newsletter. And that's where you could get up to date with any labour mobility information that Alicia would be sharing. You would find it on the newsletter. Just log on to our website or just access your emails, and you should be able to find the link there.
No, thank you, Wame, and thank you to all the participants for joining us today. Malo Aupito.
Thank you so very much. Have a good afternoon all. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.